In this video, I'm going to go over Carl Jung's 7 steps to the collective unconscious. So what I mean by Jung's steps are his reasoning to get him to the conclusion of the existence of a collective unconscious. Okay, so we're going to go step by step until you get to the understanding of how Jung arrived at the concept of the collective unconscious. Okay. So we're going to go through these steps here. We're going to go through how he sets his boundaries of inquiry, immediate experience, how to differentiate between psychic facts, 7 categories of consciousness, existence of unconscious processes, unconscious contents, and go through the question, does the unconscious have dreams? Now, by that, I don't mean normal dreams when you go to sleep. I don't mean those dreams. I mean, does the unconscious have dreams of its own? Now, you'll have to stick around and watch the whole video to get down to understand that mystery and how that relates to Jung's conception of the collective unconscious, because it's very important. It's very important to his understanding of what the collective unconscious is. Okay, so we're going to go through all these 7, so stick with me. And by the end of it, you'll understand also what the collective unconscious is as well, because I'll explain that at the end. All right, so just stick with me as we go through this, and you'll get a lot out of it and understand Jung's reasoning step by step to get him to the conclusion of the collective unconscious. Okay, so everything that I'm saying to you in this video is from Jung's essay, The Structure of the Psyche. All right, so you can find it in Volume 8 of the Collected Works, which is titled The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. All right, so if you want to look that up, you can go to Jung's Collected Works, all right, and read it for yourself. But I'm going to go through these points here. So what does he mean by sets his boundaries of inquiry? All right, so first it starts off with a big picture view. All right, so Jung likens the psyche as a reflection of the world and man. And it is a thing of such infinite complexity, all right, that it can be studied and observed from many different angles, many different ways to observe the phenomena of the psyche, all right. So it's a general thing. It's so complex. He likens it to a systematic understanding of the world, the universe itself, all right. So we don't understand everything about the universe. We don't understand everything about reality. Okay, so it's too complex, and it's the same as the psyche. It's infinitely complex, even though it's a segment of reality as a whole. It itself is infinitely complex. So Jung is admitting in the beginning the boundaries of his inquiry, that it's so complex that he's not going to be able to formulate something that explains everything. All right, but he goes on here and he says, everyone makes for himself his own segment of world and constructs his own private system, often with airtight compartments, so that after a time it seems to him that he has grasped the meaning and structure of the whole. But the finite will never be able to grasp the infinite. All right, so he's basically saying that, from the get-go, when I'm conceptualizing things, I'm not going to be able to understand everything, and I'm not going to be able to create a theory that is so airtight that understands, that explains everything in the psyche. All right, so that's good to know. So he's got this openness that comes with his inquiry of trying to understand the psyche. So that's the first step. All right, he begins there. Then what he does is he moves on to, okay, well, how can we then move forward to inquire about the psyche? All right, and so in the second step, he says, the only things we experience immediately are the contents of consciousness. All right, so the second step is, okay, well, how then are we going to go down this inquiry, this path of understanding the psyche? Well, the only things we experience immediately are the contents of consciousness. So we're going to go down that road. We're going to understand our immediate experience, all right? And now he fleshes out also what he's going to focus on, what this means, all right? And so he says, in saying this, I'm not attempting to reduce the world to our idea of it. what I'm trying to emphasize could be expressed from another point of view. All right, so now he's going to give an example, and I'll explain what it means. He says, life is a function of the carbon atom. This analogy reveals the limitations of the specialist point of view, so which I succumb as soon as I attempt to say anything explanatory about the world or even part of it. All right? And then this explains it. He says, my point of view is naturally a psychological one, and moreover, that of a practicing psychologist whose task is to find the quickest road through the chaotic muddle of complicated psychic states. This view must needs be very different from that of the psychologist who can study in isolated psychic processes, can study an isolated psychic process at his leisure in the quiet of his laboratory. The difference is roughly that between a surgeon and an histologist. I also differ from the metaphysician who feels he has to say how things are in themselves and whether they are absolute or not. My subject lies wholly within the bounds of experience. All right? So I'll explain that a little bit. What he meant about that, he used the analogy of a specialist of a specialist saying life is a function of the carbon atom. All right, so we can look at the world as through that lens. Okay, like a physicist would look at it through that lens. Life is a function of the carbon atom. But Jung is saying his disposition is naturally a psychological one. All right, so that is his disposition, his immediate experience. We're going to look at the immediate experience of consciousness. His disposition is psychological. And what kind of psychological are we talking about? We're not talking about someone in a lab testing for specific psychological, like psychic states. We're talking about someone who is working with people. So he was a clinician. Jung was a clinician, right? So he's working with people. He's more like a surgeon in that regards. And he distinguishes himself from the metaphysician, because the metaphysician wants to know, the philosopher wants to know what something is in and of itself. Can we validate it in and of itself? But Jung is saying, my subject lies wholly within the bounds of experience. That's so fundamental to Jung's psychology. All right, because he's not making metaphysical claims. He's making psychological claims, and he tries to differentiate his psychology from philosophy. All right, so he's not saying, does it really mean something? It's only as if it means something. All right, so he's talking about experience. Okay, so he's going to focus, the general inquiry now is going to focus in through a psychological view of people's experience. All right, that's what he's going to focus in on. All right, now, yes, so we'll move on now to differentiate between psychic facts. So what he says here, right, is he says, now that we understand that that's what I'm focusing on, and I'm focusing on a psychological perspective, and I'm working with clients and patients, he says here, my prime need is to grasp complicated conditions and be able to talk about them. I must be able to differentiate between various groups of psychic facts. The distinction so made must not be arbitrary, since I have to reach an understanding with my patient. Therefore, I have to rely on simple schemata, which on the one hand satisfactorily reflect the empirical facts, and on the other hand, link up with what is generally known and so finds acceptance. All right, so he needs to be able to differentiate between psychic facts. Otherwise, it's just gobbledygook. It's just, it's the psyche and that's it. And so he needs to be able to differentiate between different psychic facts so that he can actually help his patients, because he's dealing with complex psychological issues, and if he can't differentiate between psychic facts, then he can't hold on to them or use them in a way to help his clients, right? And they can't just be arbitrary. He can't just invent his own differentiation out of nowhere. It has to be, a schemata, a simple schemata. So something that he can use, like it has a pragmatic use, which on the one hand satisfactorily reflects the empirical facts. Okay, so it needs to be based on some empirical evidence, and on the other hand, it has to link up with what is generally known. So it has to link up with the experience of the patients that he's talking with. All right, so that's an important step, that he has to differentiate between psychic facts. That helped, because Jung is a theorist, and so that helped him. That helps him to create and build his theory. All right. And so that's that there. And then what he does then is he moves on to 7 categories of consciousness. And so once Jung has understood that he needs to differentiate between psychic facts, he then begins to do that. And he moves on to the 7 categories of consciousness. Now he differentiates between different categories of consciousness, and that's what he's going to do now. All right, and so the 7 categories of this. Okay, the first 4 I've gone over this point, actually 7 categories of consciousness. I've gone over this in a former video in great detail. I'm going to link that in the description. So if you want to go into the 7 categories of consciousness, I actually explain it a lot more in detail in another video. But I'm just going to go over it quickly here so you understand what it is. But it's still vital we go over it, because it helps us understand later on his reasoning for other things. All right. So first off, the first 4 categories are sense perceptions. So sensation, which is physiological, and then sensation tells you what what is. Sensation tells you that there is something there, right? That something is. And then thinking is a psychic a perception that tells you what something is. Okay, so sense perception is number 1. Number 2 is thinking. And number 3 is feeling. Feeling evaluates. Okay, it tells you if something is agreeable or not. And the 4th one is intuition. Okay, so that is, Jung says, perception of the possibilities inherent in a situation. Okay, so that's what that is. And then he goes on to say that there is volitional and instinctual categorization. So there's a directed impulses, or our so-called free will. And so that brings us to the 5th category of consciousness, which is our attention. We have our attention, right? What we can focus on with our so-called will, right? And then in the instinctual, or the undirected unconscious impulses, we have 2 more categories. We got fantasy or daydreaming, right? Because it just spontaneously happens. It's undirected. It's irrational. Then we have the 7th category is dreams. All right. So, that's undirected. It's irrational. We're just dreaming. It's, we don't have conscious control over that. Okay. And then, so that's it. They're the 7 categories of consciousness. So he differentiates between them. All right. So that differentiation is now useful for helping his patients and clients. All right. And so if you know anything about Myers-Briggs or typology, you'll understand sense perception, thinking, feeling, and intuition. All right. And that does help people, understand the differences between other people, and so on and so forth. All right. So then he says here, this quote, it's important. These 7 categories probably give a somewhat superficial survey of the contents of consciousness, but they are sufficient for our purpose. All right. So remember, he's only doing this for a purpose, to help his clients to, so he's dealing with he's creating and constructing these theories to understand the phenomena he sees, and for it to be a tool of usefulness to as a clinician. So that's that. So once he outlines the 7 categories of consciousness, he then goes on to the existence of unconscious processes. So he says here, there are, as we know, certain views which would restrict everything psychic to consciousness as being identified with it. So some people want to restrict everything to just consciousness. They don't believe that anything else exists in the psyche but what we can experience through our consciousness. All right, which is, yeah, so some people apparently believe that, right? But Jung goes on, I do not believe this is sufficient. If we assume that there is anything at all beyond our sense perception, then we are entitled to speak of psychic elements whose existence is only indirectly accessible to us. Okay, so that's his like reciprocal burden argument there. That's his rationalization. So if we posit that something's beyond our sense perception, then surely we can posit that there's other unconscious elements beyond our consciousness. Okay, so of course there's things beyond our sense perception. So why wouldn't there be things beyond our consciousness within? All right, so he's basically, applying the understanding of the external exploration to an internal exploration. Okay, and now he says in the symptomology. So then he gives 2 examples. He gives an example of hypnotism and somnambulism, and so he'll explain it here, which gives rise to the existence of unconscious processes. He's trying to prove the existence of unconscious processes. Okay, in the symptomology of such states, such as hypnotism, there are innumerable cases of this kind, where with the best will in the world, one can only say that these people perceive, think, feel, remember, decide, and act unconsciously, doing unconsciously what others do consciously. These processes occur regardless of whether consciousness registers them or not. All right, so Jung is dead on here. He's referenced experiences where people have been hypnotized, or they have certain conditions. So that a person used to have this neurosis that every time a naked flame was lit in front of them, they would pass out. Okay, so obviously this neurological response to a naked flame. All right, so what would happen was they were actually partially blind, and they would light the naked flame in the blind spot, so the person wouldn't consciously register the naked flame, so they weren't consciously aware of the flame, but the flame yet still caused them to have a fit or whatever and pass out. Okay, so that's one example Jung gives of someone not consciously being aware of something but still reacting to it. Okay, so the unconscious element of them, unconscious processes there, are taking over and reacting to something in the environment. All right, and so anyone who really disputes this point is kind of an idiot at this point, because even in our modern understanding of say I've been learning about memory, right? And so I'm going to release a video soon on memory, a part of my Psychology 101 course, right? So stick around for that. But basically, there's such thing as implicit memory. All right, so you pick up on things all the time unconsciously, and it's stored as a part of your memory, but it's unconsciously stored, and you didn't even know that you stored it in your memory. So there's lots of examples of the existence of unconscious processes. All right, and that's pretty much it's strongly substantiated. So there's that. So let's move on here. Yes. So that goes into the dream. So sleep is a state in which consciousness is greatly restricted. The psyche by no means ceases to exist and to act. Consciousness has merely withdrawn from it and, lacking any objects to hold its attention, lapsed into a state of comparative unconsciousness. But psychic life obviously goes on, just as there is unconscious psychic activity during the waking state. So basically, obviously dreams are an example of, of unconscious processes when we're asleep, because something's going on there. Consciousness has gone because we're asleep, but yet something is still processing, and when we have dreams, right? And so he also says these unconscious processes also indulge. I don't know what that says there. Unconscious processes also include the labor of composition that goes into a dream. So dreams seem to have narrative-like structures, okay? And they're composed in a narrative. So that unconsciously happens. It's not like we consciously sat down and thought up of this narrative, for the dream that we're experiencing. So these dreams seem to have narratives, and the unconscious seems to piece together those narratives. So some type of processing is going on there as well. So he's giving these examples, of dreams, of hypnotism, of people with certain neuroses and reactions to stuff. So that's that. And so he also says evidence for this is not difficult to find. Indeed, and then now he invokes Freud to substantiate the existence of unconscious processes. Freud has described this particular field of experience in the psychopathology of everyday life. He shows that our conscious intentions and actions are often frustrated by unconscious processes whose very existence is a continual surprise to us. We make slips of the tongue and slips in writing, and unconsciously do things that betray our most closely guarded secrets, which are sometimes unknown even to ourselves. All right, so they're all examples of the existence of unconscious processes. And then he says phenomenon demonstrated, and he also talks about the phenomenon demonstrated. That phenomenon can be demonstrated experimentally through Jung's association word tests that he gives people. So he tests people, and it actually draws out unconscious and hidden motives of people as well. Okay, so that's an experimentation there that can also prove the existence of unconscious processes. And so classic examples of unconscious psychic activity are to be found in pathological states, hysteria, compulsion, neurosis, phobias. Schizophrenia has its roots in unconscious psychic activity. So I'm going to read this quote. The unconscious, then, is part of the psyche. Can we now, on the analogy of the different contents of consciousness, also speak of contents of the unconscious? That would be postulating another consciousness, so to speak, in the unconscious. All right, let me say that again. That would be postulating another consciousness in the unconscious. All right, so then let's continue. I will not go into this delicate question here, since I have discussed it in another connection, but will confine myself to inquiring whether we can differentiate anything in the unconscious or not. All right, so he's not going to completely deal with that here. He deals with it somewhere else. So I'm going to go and find that eventually and make a video on it to substantiate that point. Okay, to substantiate the point, whether the unconscious has contents. All right. But then he basically says, can we differentiate anything in the unconscious or not? All right, because if we can't differentiate anything in the unconscious, it's kind of useless. All right, the same as if we can't differentiate anything in consciousness, it's useless to help people. All right, to use as a theory to help people. Okay, so that he says this question can only be answered empirically, that is, by the counter question, whether there are any plausible grounds for such a differentiation. So is there any plausible grounds for a differentiation? That will help us understand the contents of the unconscious, all right? To my mind, this is Jung, to my mind, there is no doubt that all the activities ordinarily taking place in consciousness can also proceed in the unconscious. Okay, so he believes that everything going on in consciousness can also be in the unconscious contents. Okay, and he basically gives an example of this. I think it was a banker or something like that, dealing with some accounting problem or fraud problem, something. And at midnight, he gives up and he can't figure out this problem anymore. He goes to bed. His wife notes that he wakes up at 3 a.m. in the morning. She follows him into the study where he jots down a few things for 15 minutes. Then he goes back to sleep, right? He wakes up in the morning and doesn't even remember doing that at all. He goes over and finds in his own handwriting the solution to the problem that he's been trying to work out. All right, so that's one example Jung gives of unconscious contents. So it's as if that person has all the contents of consciousness, the ability to solve problems, the ability to do this and that. All right, so that's an example there. And then he moves on and talks about dreams and their utility as unconscious contents. He says he's been doing dreams for 20 years, dealing with clients' dreams, right? And these dreams express the thoughts and feelings, of the person, and it helps those thoughts and feelings reach the person indirectly. It's an indirect message from the unconscious, really. Okay, so and then he says dream content of consciousness. Otherwise, it would be dreams of contents of consciousness. Otherwise, it would be an object of immediate experience. It would not be an object of immediate experience. So dreams are a content of consciousness because we actually experience them, right? And if we didn't experience them, then it wouldn't be in our consciousness, right? But insofar as it brings up material that was unconscious before, such as thoughts and feelings, we are forced to assume that these contents already had some kind of psychic existence in an unconscious state and appeared to the remnant of consciousness only in the dream. The dream belongs to the normal contents of the psyche and may be regarded as the resultant of unconscious processes obtruding on consciousness. All right, so basically we experience dreams as contents of consciousness, but where were they before? Where were those feelings and thoughts before they turned into a dream that manifested into consciousness? And Jung posits, because of that, that they are unconscious contents obtruding into consciousness. So we experience them as conscious content, but they actually are from the unconscious, so they originate from the unconscious. And that makes sense there, right? So he's now down two things: dreams, and he's now down, the ability to figure out problems and stuff like that. All right. So that goes to there. Now, what he does now is something a bit crazy. Then he says, okay, well, we can differentiate between some parts of unconscious contents. We can obviously see we've got dreams, we've got other things over here. So then he posits an unusual thing here where he says, all right, now he says here, now, if with these experiences in mind, we are driven to assume that all the categories of conscious contents can on occasion also be unconscious and can act on the conscious mind as unconscious processes, we find ourselves faced with the somewhat unexpected question whether the unconscious has dreams too. In other words, are there resultants of still deeper, and if that be possible, still more unconscious processes which infiltrate into the dark regions of the psyche? I should have to dismiss this paradoxical question as altogether too adventurous, were there not, in fact, grounds which bring such a hypothesis within the realm of possibility. All right, so I want to break that down there a little bit. So he's basically saying, okay, so we can understand that the unconscious contents, everything in the conscious contents can happen it can happen unconsciously. All right. And if that's so, then why couldn't the unconscious itself also have dreams as well, have dreams of its own, separate from the dreams we have that we experience in consciousness at night when we sleep? And so he's like, and then he says, well, that's a bit, too adventurous of a hypothesis. But then he says, it would be too adventurous were there not, in fact, grounds which bring such a hypothesis within the realm of possibility. So he's saying, well, there are actually grounds to say that this could be possible, that the unconscious could actually have dreams of its own. Because remember, earlier he posited that the unconscious had a consciousness of its own, separate to our consciousness. So it's like there's two consciousnesses. There's our consciousness, and then the unconscious has its own consciousness that actually has dreams. All right. Now, you'll see soon that these dreams, he's trying to differentiate this again. He's trying to differentiate the different contents in the unconscious. That's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to show you that there's different contents within the unconscious, and that if the unconscious has dreams, that means there's a deeper level to the unconscious part of the psyche. And that's where he's talking about the collective unconscious. So dreams are actually, the dream of Jung's understanding is that the dream of the unconscious is actually the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is kind of like the deepest level of the unconscious psyche. That is like a dream kind of world, like a mythological kind of world, and it's the psychological, underpinning of the other unconscious, the personal unconscious, and then obviously our consciousness. All right, so he's trying to differentiate between them by trying to single out dreams as a part of contents, dreams as a differentiated content in the unconscious. All right, and so now to do that, he gives two different examples. Now I'm going to go over those two examples quickly here, but basically the first example he gives is basically before that he says we must first see what sort of evidence is required to prove that the unconscious has dreams. If we wish to prove that dreams appear as contents of consciousness, we have simply to show that there are certain contents which, in character and meaning, are strange and not to be compared with the other contents which can be rationally explained and understood. Okay? If we are to show that the unconscious also has dreams, we must treat its contents in a similar way. It will be simplest if I give a practical example. All right, so just that reasoning there, he's saying, well, we're trying to differentiate, does the unconscious have dreams? Well, in consciousness, we can differentiate if consciousness has dreams. It's because dreams have a peculiar structure with a certain character and meaning, and we can see that phenomena of dreams is different to other rational phenomena of thinking and feeling, etc. Okay, so If we can do that in the consciously, then surely we could also do that in the unconscious as well, and differentiate between, by using that understanding of the character and meaning of what a dream would constitute in the unconscious. All right, that's what he's trying to do. And so as the man expresses his sorrow over this breakup he had with this girl that he was with, because the girl got engaged to another man and left him. He felt bad about that, but he didn't express it. So it unconsciously then was expressed in, a pain in his throat and in his heart. Okay. And so once he started to weep and cry, then his heartache went away and his throat, the stuck thing in his throat went away. Okay. So he was unconsciously holding on, manifesting symptoms because he didn't process something emotionally. All right. And so we know that happens. So once he was freed up of that was fine. It was gone. All right. But he still had the third symptom, the pain in his left foot. So Jung's now using this as a way to differentiate between contents of the unconscious. So this person had these symptoms, and so the weeping was able to cure him of the pain in his heart and in his throat. All right, so those two symptoms went away. So that shows indicative of one type of unconscious contents. Okay, so unconsciously holding on to emotions. All right, but the other type, the third symptom, was a pain in his heel that did not disappear. Now, basically, now Jung goes through how the heartbreak and all that is not connected to his heel. From a rational point of view, we cannot see why the other two symptoms should not have sufficed. What's the deal with this foot? Why is the foot hurting? Now, because Jung couldn't work it out rationally, he then asked him and turned to his dreams. All right. And so this guy actually had a dream. The patient now had a dream in which he was bitten in the heel by a snake and instantly paralyzed. This dream plainly offered an interpretation of the heel symptom. His heel hurt him because he had been bitten there by a snake. This is a very strange content, and one can make nothing of it rationally. We could understand at once why his heart ached, but that his heel should ache too is beyond all rational expectation. The patient was completely mystified. Okay, so basically, then Jung goes on to explain how also not only his dream, but his dream lines up with the story of Adam and Eve. So obviously in Adam and Eve, it says something like, and I will put enmity, God says in the Old Testament, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Okay, so that's a motif of what's going on. That's a motif that aligns up with the guy's dream and with his physical symptom. Now, Jung shows another motif which is an Egyptian hymn that also aligns with the guy's symptom and his dream, and with the idea in Genesis, okay, of the heel being bitten or whatever, okay. And I'm not going to read it out to save time, but he quotes that. And then Jung says here, the patient's conscious knowledge of the Bible was at a lamentable minimum. So he wasn't really conscious of the Bible very much. Probably he had once heard of the serpent biting the heel and then quickly forgotten it. But something deep in his unconscious heard it and did not forget. It remembered this story at a suitable opportunity. This part of the unconscious evidently likes to express itself mythologically, because this way of expression is in keeping with its nature. So he's saying basically the guy could have heard about, the biblical story, even though he wasn't well versed in the Bible. He kind of didn't really know anything about it, but he could have heard it, right? And it seems as if the unconscious clinged on to that mythological structure and story and expressed it, and expresses itself mythologically through these stories for whatever reason. Why is it that the contents of the dream surrounded around that particular thing. Okay. And then Jung goes on, but to what kind of mentality does this symbolical or metaphorical way of expression correspond? It corresponds to the mentality of the primitive, okay, whose language possesses no abstractions, but only natural and unnatural analogies. This primeval mentality is as foreign to the psyche that produced the heartache and the lump in the throat as a brontosaurus is to a racehorse. The dream of the snake reveals a fragment of psychic activity that has nothing whatever to do with the dreamer as a modern individual. It functions at a deeper level, so to speak, and only the results of this activity rise up into the upper layer where the repressed effects lie, as foreign to them as a dream is to waking consciousness. Just as some kind of analytical technique is needed to understand a dream, so a knowledge of mythology is needed in order to grasp the meaning of a content deriving from the deeper levels of the psyche. The snake motif was certainly not an individual acquisition of the dreamer, for snake dreams are very common even among city dwellers who have probably never seen a real snake. It might be objected that the snake in the dream is nothing but a concretized figure of speech. We say of certain women that they are treacherous as snakes, wily as serpents. We speak of the snake of temptation, etc. This objection does not seem to me to hold good in the present instance, though it would be difficult to prove this because the snake is in fact a common figure of speech. A more certain proof would be possible only if we succeeded in finding a case where the mythological symbolism is neither a common figure of speech nor an instance of cryptomnesia, that is to say, where the dreamer had not read, seen, or heard the motif somewhere, and then forgotten it and remembered it unconsciously. Okay, so he's saying this dream, this example has its problems. So now he's going to give a second example to rectify those problems of cryptomnesia and of it's a common figure of speech in this dream about snakes and stuff. Okay, so he's going to get rid of that. He's trying to find something that's uncommon, that's not connected to common speech, because it could have just seeped into the dream because of that. And it's not cryptomnesia. He hasn't just heard it before, like some biblical story that's popular, all right, where he's seen it before and it just is in his unconscious, all right? So he's trying to eliminate those two aspects and find an example that then would prove that. But at the very least, this example at least proves that there are unconscious contents that seem to want to express themselves mythologically. That's the point Jung is making here, that there are contents in the unconscious that express themselves mythologically. So if we study mythology, we'll be able to understand these contents. So for whatever reason, they seem to grab onto these narrative structures, all right? And so that's what Jung's talking about there, is trying to differentiate a little bit between different contents in the unconscious, okay, between cryptomnesia and etc. All right, okay, so then what he does is, let's just see here. He says, this proof that he's trying to prove now, this proof seems to me of great importance, since it would show that the rationally explicable unconscious, which consists of material that has been unconscious artificially, as it were, is only a top layer, and that underneath is an absolute unconscious, which has nothing to do with our personal experience. This absolute unconscious would then be a psychic activity which goes on independently of the conscious mind and is not dependent even on the upper layers of the unconscious. So Jung is saying here that the deeper level of the unconscious remains untouched and perhaps untouchable by personal experience. It would be a kind of supra-individual psychic activity, a collective unconscious, as I have called it, as distinct from a superficial, relative, or personal unconscious, okay? So he's distinguishing between the contents in the unconscious because he's trying to get to the collective unconscious, which he sees as the dream of unconsciousness, okay? And so which is this mythological structure, which takes this mythological structure. Now, before he goes and gives the second example to mitigate against the problems inherent in the first example, namely cryptomnesia and the common use of the snake metaphor. Before we go into that, he just quickly finishes on the snake thing, and he basically says that he talks about some ceremonies and stuff like that happen in Christianity, and he basically says that these ceremonies are kind of like very emotionally validating for people, and he basically says that if we look at those original symptoms like having a heartache and pain in the throat, and we can see that those symptoms are manifestations to indicate to lead a person to healing. So the person can eventually come and weep and cry, and then their heartbreak can be healed, right? So those symptoms are to lead to healing. So like that, those symptoms lead to healing. So do the symptoms of the guy's foot, which are linked to this mythological motif of a snake. But instead of just personal healing, he likens it to Christianity, where there's this community kind of healing, where they all participate in mass, which is, like a Christian type of Catholic type of, ceremony, right? So he says here, the rationalists may laugh at this, but something deep in us is stirred, and not in us alone, but in millions of Christian men and women. Though we may call it only a feeling for beauty, what is stirred in us is that faraway background, those immemorial patterns of the human mind, which we have not acquired, but have inherited from the dim ages of the past. So there's something about that collective involvement in these kind of ceremonies that are emotionally healing or something like that, right? So then he goes on and says, and links this to this guy's problem with the snake. If this super individual psyche exists, everything that is translated into its picture language would be depersonalized, and if this became conscious, would appear to us subspecies aeternitatis, which is not as my sorrow, but as the sorrow of the world, not a personal isolating pain, but a pain without bitterness that unites all humanity. The healing effect of this needs no proof. Okay? So basically, he's just saying there that dream of the snake biting that guy's foot and that pain is something he shares mythologically with, with all humanity, really. So, because Jung looks at the dream of the unconscious is the collective unconscious, which is a mythological strata of the psyche, which is seen as also the objective, which is also seen as kind of like the objective unconscious or something like that, because there's like, so he also sees the collective unconscious as the objective unconscious, so it's this weird terminology, but it's objective because everyone experiences it. We're all connected in the collective unconscious. It's this objective unconscious experience that we all sharing. So this pain, he's saying, is the pain of humanity manifested in this guy's pain in his foot, and manifested to that dream that he had about the snake bite, which connects to all the different mythological motifs. Okay, and so that's there, right? But now he says, but as to whether this super individual psychic activity actually exists, I have so far given no proof that satisfies all requirements, namely the cryptomnesia and all that, okay? So he basically gives this example now. The case is that of a man in his 30s who was suffering from a paranoid form of schizophrenia. He became ill in his early 20s. He had always presented a strange mixture of intelligence, wrong-headedness, and fantastic ideas. He was an ordinary clerk employed in a consulate. Evidently, as compensation for his very modest existence, he was seized with megalomania and believed himself to be the savior. He suffered from frequent hallucinations and was at times very much disturbed. In his quiet periods, he was allowed to go unattended to the corridor. One day, I came across him there, blinking through the window up at the sun and moving his head from side to side in a curious manner. He took me by the arm and said he wanted to show me something. He said, I must look at the sun with eyes half shut, and then I could see the sun's phallus. If I moved my head from side to side, the sun phallus would move too, and that was the origin of the wind. Okay, I made this observation about 1906. In the course of the year 1910, when I was engrossed in mythological studies, a book of diatriches came into my hand. It was part of the so-called Paris Magic Papyrus and was thought by Dietrich to be a liturgy of the Mithric cult. It consisted of a series of instructions, invocations, and visions. One of these visions is described in the following words, and likewise, the so-called tube, the origin of the ministering wind, for you will see hanging down from the disk of the sun, something that looks like a tube, and towards the regions westward, it is as though there were an infinite east wind, but if the other wind should prevail towards the region of the east, you will in like manner see the vision veering in that direction. The Greek word for tube means a wind instrument, and the combination in Homer means a thick jet of blood. So evidently a stream of wind is blowing through the tube out of the sun. Okay. Then Jung goes on and says, the vision of my patient in 1906 and the Greek text first edited in 1910, which actually in the footnotes it says here that it actually was edited in 1903, but the patient in 1910, that was the second edition, but the patient was committed years before 1903, okay? So they wouldn't have had access to this text. Should be sufficiently far apart to rule out the possibility of cryptomnesia on his side and of thought transference on mine, meaning Jung's. The obvious parallelism of the two visions cannot be disputed, though one might object that the similarity is purely fictitious. In that case, we should expect the vision to have no connections with analogous ideas, nor any inner meaning. But this expectation is not fulfilled, for in certain medieval paintings, this tube is actually depicted as a sort of hose pipe reaching down from heaven under the robe of Mary. In it, the Holy Ghost flies down in the form of a dove to pregnate the Virgin. As we know from the miracle of Pentecost, the Holy Ghost was originally conceived as a mighty rushing wind, the wind that bloweth where it listeth. In the Latin text we read, then he says, they say that the Spirit descends through the disk of the sun. Okay, this conception is common to the whole of late classical and medieval philosophy. All right, I cannot therefore discover anything fortuitous in these visions, but simply the revival of possibilities of ideas that have always existed, that can be found again in the most diverse minds and in all epochs, and are therefore not to be mistaken for inherited ideas. Okay, so it's not just like someone experienced it and then they inherited it. Their son inherited that experience or something like that. Okay, I've purposely gone into the details of this case in order to give you a concrete picture of the deeper psychic activity, which I call the collective unconscious. Summing up, I would like to emphasize that we must distinguish three psychic levels: consciousness, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. All right. So basically, that's that for his kind of proof, I guess, on the collective unconscious. Then he goes on and talks about what the collective unconscious is, and I'll continue and tell you about his thoughts and ideas on the collective unconscious. But before I go there, I want to say, when he was interviewed, though, there's only like 3 or so interviews of him. He was interviewed and asked about the collective unconscious, and then he gave that same example about, you know, the schizophrenic and the origin of the wind, and then finding it in that text, that magical text or whatever. He gave that same parallel as an example, but then the interviewer asked him, and you believe that this is proof of the collective unconscious? And Jung says, oh, well, it's not a proof, but it's a hint, and I took the hint. Okay, but in here, in this essay, he outlines it as a kind of proof. But then Jung goes on to explain the collective unconscious. Okay, so the collective unconscious, so far as we can say anything about it at all, appears to consist of mythological motifs or primordial images, for which reason the myths of all nations are its real exponents. In fact, the whole of mythology could be taken as a sort of projection of the collective unconscious. We can see this most clearly if we look at the heavenly constellations, whose originally chaotic forms were organized through the projection of images. This explains the influence of the stars as asserted by astrologers. These influences are nothing but unconscious, introspective perceptions of the activity of the collective unconscious. Okay, just as the constellations were projected into the heavens, similar figures were projected into legends and fairy tales or upon historical persons. We can therefore study the collective unconscious in 2 ways, either in mythology or in the analysis of the individual. As I cannot make the latter material available here, I must confine myself to mythology. This is such a wide field that we can select from it only a few types. Okay, so yeah, so just as the people back in the day, the astrologers, it's not that anything was in the stars, it's that they projected their own meaning onto the stars. And because they did project their own meaning onto it, it did mean something because it actually reflected a part of their own psychology. So that's what Jung's saying there, okay? So, you know, all of kind of mythology is a projection of the unconscious strata into these narratives, right? And so he also explains it here, what the collective unconscious is. Just as the living body with its special characteristics is a system of functions for adapting to environmental conditions, so the psyche must exhibit organs or functional systems that correspond to regular physical events. By this, I do not mean sense functions dependent on organs, but rather a sort of psychic parallel to regular physical occurrences. To take an example, the daily course of the sun and the regular alternation of day and night must imprint themselves on the psyche in the form of an image from primordial times. We cannot demonstrate the existence of this image, but we find instead more or less fantastic analogies of the physical process. Okay, so then he gives like examples. So basically, these archetypes that give rise to these mythological motifs in the collective unconscious are actually kind of from these physical, these regular physical occurrences that like are always there, you know. And so day and night is always there, you know, and we're being shaped by day and night, right? And then there's these mythological motifs that manifest. The divine hero is born from the sea and mounts the chariot of the sun. In the west, a great mother awaits him. and he is devoured by her in the evening in the belly of a dragon. He traverses the depths of the midnight sea after a frightful combat with the serpent of night. He is born again in the morning. So that's a mythological motif that is a manifestation of the regularity of physical circumstances around the human psyche, the imprint it made on the human psyche to create a primordial image, which is an archetypal expression within the collective unconscious. Okay, so that's kind of, he explains that, and then he also talks about how it's the same as there's always a mother, a father, and you know what I mean? So that mother and father is also an archetype because it's always there. You always have a mother and father, always have this family archetypal structure to the psyche, okay? And so he likens that to adaptation. And so consciousness is what adapts us to our current environment, but then there's this underlying structure, and he likens it to our body. Obviously, we adapt to our current environment, but there is a structure that's adapted to the long term, okay? We've got arms and legs. We can't just, completely transform our arm into something else, into a surfboard, you know what I mean? Then I'm just surfing on the waves. It's no, I'm stuck with this structure, but yet I am adapting to the environment around me in real time, but I have this ancient structure of a body that has evolved to kind of to be here. It's the same as the psyche. He says that the collective unconscious is this ancient structure that is kind of evolved to be there to handle circumstances over the long haul. So these archetypal circumstances of day and night, mother and father, etc. And consciousness is to deal with, the adaptation of the here and now, okay? And so that's what he kind of gets into there. Yes, and then he says that this is so immediately understandable when we consider that the unconscious, as the totality of all archetypes, is the deposit of all human experience right back to its remotest beginnings. Not indeed a dead deposit, a sort of abandoned rubbish heap, but a living system of reactions and aptitudes that determine the individual's life. In invisible ways, all the more effective because invisible, it is not just a gigantic historical prejudice, so to speak, an a priori historical condition. It is also the source of the instincts, for the archetypes are simply the forms which the instincts assume. From the living fountain of instinct flows everything that is creative. Hence, the unconscious is not merely conditioned by history, but is the very source of the creative impulse. It is like nature herself, prodigiously conservative and yet transcending her own historical conditions in her acts of creation. No wonder then that it has always been a burning question for humanity how best to adapt to these invisible determinants. That's awesome. And then he says, if consciousness had never split off from the unconscious, an eternally repeated event symbolized as the fall of the angels and the disobedience of the first parents, this problem would never have arisen, and any more than would the question of environmental adaptation. Yes. So then he says, the existence of an individual consciousness makes man aware of the difficulties of his inner as well as his outer life, just as the world about him takes on a friendly or a hostile aspect to the eyes of primitive man. So the influences of his unconscious seem to him like an imposing power with which he has to come to terms with, just as with the visible world. His countless magical practices serve this end. On higher levels of civilization, religion, and philosophy fulfill the same purpose. Whenever such a system of adaptation breaks down, a general unrest begins to appear, and attempts are made to find a suitable new form of relationship to the unconscious. Okay, So that's a bit complex there, but a lot of that has to do with my old video that I made about this tension between the opposites, between consciousness and unconscious, and there's a tension between them. So watch my video on the 4 stages, Carl Jung's 4 stages of life, if you want to know more about that. Okay guys, so I'll end it with this quote from Jung. The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of humankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. His conscious mind is an ephemeral phenomenon that accomplishes all provisional adaptations and orientations, for which reason one can best compare its function to orientation in space. The unconscious, on the other hand, is the source of the instinctual forces of the psyche and of the forms or categories that regulate them, namely the archetypes. All the most powerful ideas in history go back to archetypes. This is particularly true of religious ideas, but the central concepts of science, philosophy, and ethics are no exception to this rule. In their present form, they are variants of archetypal ideas created by consciously applying and adapting these ideas to reality. For it is the function of consciousness not only to recognize and assimilate the external world through the gateway of the senses, but to translate into visible reality the world within us. Okay, so thank you for watching this. If you've liked this video, please subscribe. Please give me a thumbs up and share it. Comment down below if you have any questions. It really helps my channel. And I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.